So this is now the overview of macroeconomics. Now, what is macroeconomics? By the way, AE 104 is more on macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, that is the economy as a whole or its aggregate. So this time, we are now going to talk about the totality. So it is said to be the whole economy. Unlike in your AE 101, it's just the general principles, okay? Now, this time, it seeks now to obtain an overview or general outline of the structure of the economy and the relationship of its major aggregates. So there are so many things or factors that we need now to take into consideration. Like, for example, we will be discussing whether or not a country has an absolute or comparative advantage. We will be discussing also the importance of gross national product, especially in our economic growth. And then we will also be discussing economic development. Okay. So, what is macroeconomics? It is also known as the theory of the economy. Now, when you say macro, it has a wider scope. It has a larger scope. So, it speaks of total output, total employment, total income, aggregate expenditures, or the general level of prices. So we will now be talking here trade performance with other countries, but are now relative success or failure of government economic policies. Now, in line with this, likewise, we will also be including our discussion on money flows. So there are money inflows and money outflows, and the movement of goods and services in our economy, especially in the Philippine economy. Just to differentiate it from microeconomics, in our AE 101, this is being emphasized. So microeconomics, it is concerned primarily with the market activities on individual economic units such as consumers, resource owners, and business firms. Okay? Now, it speaks of individual output, employment, income, expenditures, and level of prices. In other words, when you talk about microeconomics, it is otherwise known as price theory. Unlike macro, it is now the economy of the whole. Okay? So, it speaks of a larger aspect. Now, what is an economic growth? Economic growth is an increase in the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services. So when you say economic growth, it can be measured, okay? So you can compare this from one period of time to another. It is usually indicated by an increase in our gross domestic product. So please do not mix this with your GNP because GDP is totally different from your gross national product. GDP is an economic model that reflects the value of a country's output. Now, in other words, when you talk about your gross domestic product, it is the total monetary value of the goods and services produced by that country over a specific period of time. Now, there are two types of economic growth. One is the balanced economic growth, and the second one is the unbalanced economic growth. Now, when you talk about the balanced economic growth class, all the economic sectors, if it is balanced, are growing at the same ratio or percentage. So let's say as to your natural resources, it is said to be the same ratio with the technology that you used, okay? Or it has also the same ratio with the manpower who will now be operating such technology. This is not true in unbalanced economic growth. Why? Because there are some sectors of the economy that are growing faster, Like, for example, if you are rich in natural resources, that is where the highest percentage lies. So, and the rate of growth is different from each other. Now, so what causes economic growth? We have the first one, our natural resources. Well, we can always say that Philippines is very rich in natural resources. We are a nation rich in natural resources. And therefore, we likely experience what we call an economic growth, assuming other factors are held constant. That we call it your ceteris paribus theory. So we assume that all other things are held constant or equal. You've learned that in your AE 101. Here in your labor, likewise, there is also an increase in labor in the manpower in those people who will now be manning those machines, or those who will now be doing or trying now to come up with a finished output. So in other words, they are the ones who are now producing this output. So that is now another cause of your economic growth. Another one will be the capital. This is your investment. Money, for example. This will help you to increase not only labor productivity, but also the labor out, or we call it your output per se. Okay? So it's the finished goods that will now be produced. Now, of course, we cannot do away, but also use some technology. That's why there will be an advancement of technology. Why? Because the more advanced technology that will be used, it will now produce more output using the same amount of resources. Like, for example, you will now be planting rice, and you will be using this time what we called the modern technology. Okay, it's not the man and carabao, which is the conventional or the traditional. So with this, the same hectares, it will give you only few days to plow that when using now the conventional. So it fast track, it facilitates production. Same with the property rights structure. It encourages individuals to direct now their energies to effective economic projects. So here, you will now be helped on how you can come up with something that is said to be more important. Okay? If there are causes of economic growth, there are also obstacles. Obstacles, these are hindrances, or these are the things that will not allow you this time to come up or actualize what you want. One of which is the institutional obstacles known as your corruption and bribery. Well, this is very rampant in the government, but now it is also seen in the private sector. Okay, it has a separate discussion on this because it has a very wide discussion. The second one is what we call your vicious cycle. So what is vicious cycle? This is now the low per capita income. It creates a low level of demand and low savings rate, which limits new investment and maintains low productivity. This one, it perpetuates low income, which is further reduced by population growth, and the cycle begins again. Now, there are policies this time, at least, to promote economic growth. And what are these policies? Well, I'll be having a separate lecture on this. So one of which is our tax policy. You need to cut taxes on such activities as working and saving to increase the productive capacity of the economy. The second one is the regulatory policy. How will you differentiate this one? This regulatory will restrict, okay, some other things that will now what we call stop, or it restrict also some of the operations, especially the private sectors, that will now try to stop the competition, healthy competition, or it restrict also what we call those who would like to monopolize the business. Okay, so this regulates the increase in the cost of production for business, and consequently it reduces output. The third policy that we will be discussing will be industrial policy. This will help business compete in the world market. So we are now introducing here competition, healthy competition to every industries, okay? So that they will produce quality products. Now, what about economic development? Don't worry, we will still have further discussion on this when we now try to differentiate economic growth from economic development. Economic development is a progressive process of improving human conditions, such as the reduction of poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, inequality, disease, and exploitations. Okay? When you say economic development class, it is a process by which a nation enhances its standard of living over time. It is indicated by an increase in citizens' quality of life. It is also an increase in living standards, improvement in self-esteem needs, and freedom from oppression, as well as a greater choice. Now, we said that the real products of development are the people. We are the real products of development. As we can see in some countries, like in China, a country is only as progressive as its people. So you can see that in Japan. You can see that in the United States. You can also see that in South Korea. I hope that you can see it also in our very own country. Okay? Most importantly, to focus development programs on the development should be on the people. Okay? Why? Because the people are the true key factors in improving the conditions of their own nations. I'm just sad because there are a few people who are taking agricultural engineering, agricultural economics, and so forth, and so on. These are very important nowadays because this is where the problem lies. Okay. Now, also the presence of abundant raw materials and financial resources is useless if the people do not know how to use them properly. What are the objectives of development? One of which is to increase our gross national product. Why is it that we need to increase our gross national product? Because when you talk about your GNP, we're not only talking about the income of the Filipinos in our country, but those who are also working abroad. So the income, that's why we always say that our OFWs are our heroes, okay? Because they're also contributing dollars in the Philippines. Another objectives of development is for us to attain economic stability that we were not able to do so because of the past pandemic, okay? There are a lot of jobs, there are a lot of industries that were not able to operate because of this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we also have to have equitable distribution of the fruits of economic development. Well, we're still lucky in the Philippines because you can own your own business, unlike in other countries, which is said to be in a communist country where it is being monopolized by the government. Okay? And Why do we need to increase GNP? Why do we need to attain economic stability? Why do we need to have equitable distribution of the fruits of economic development? For us to have the achievement of total development for every Filipino. So that is our intention. Okay? That's why we want this time to have a very healthy economic development. Okay? Now, there are also hindrances why we cannot see this. So there are barriers why we cannot see this economic development. One is the existence of market. That's not market failure. Okay? When you say market failure, we are now talking about the externalities. So let me check that one, market failure. Okay? So we are talking now about the externalities. So when you say externalities class, you have to take into consideration this time that there are outside factors like those industries who monopolizes a particular product, okay? Because they have undue influence, they have the power. And of course, these products usually are public goods like our electricity, okay? So that's one that hinders economic development. Another one is the problems of lack of infrastructure. You know the reason probably why we have problems now in agriculture because we don't have a market or a marketing plan wherein whenever we go to one um, government agencies or even private institution. We also lack public transport or the transportation likewise. Like for example, what if the product is coming from a remote area? So we need this time a transportation, okay? And with that, that is also another problem. And then other um, problems are the legal structures, okay? And then the last one is the problems of equity and allocation. So this is more of our wealth and income distribution. In the Philippines, the rich becomes richer and the poor becomes poorer. Okay, that is what is actually being said by one of the economists. And then another obstacle or hindrance to development is we don't have enough capital. We're still borrowing from big banks. We're still borrowing from what we call the International Monetary Fund. We're still borrowing from the World Bank and so forth and so on. And also another obstacle to development is because of population explosion. We have now too many people and there is what we call a very small or we don't have enough resources or because we lack discipline. So the last obstacle is man himself. Okay, so those are the obstacles to economic development. Now, what are some economic development indicators? Let's start with the gross domestic product per capita. What is GDP per capita? This we call it the growing development population. It is actually divided by a mid-year population. Okay, don't worry, I will not be asking you to compute this anymore. Okay, this is actually the work of the PSA, Philippine Statistics Association. It is now the sum of gross value added by all residents, producers in the economy plus taxes minus subsidies. Okay, there are no deductions on depreciations. So we have the second one is our income distribution. Well, in the Philippines, we have a proportionate. What does it mean? Income level of people of certain country increases and there is an equitable distribution. And then the third is the literacy and education. When you say literacy, how well people are being trained, how well these people have the access to education so that they can contribute, especially their talent skills on how they can now make themselves productive and contribute now for the benefit of the whole economy. Okay? And then the fourth one is access to health care. This is what we lack during pandemic. We still need aid from other countries because we don't have enough vaccines. We don't have our own vaccines, okay? We cannot test it. We don't have the apparatus. We don't have the facilities. So that's one thing to consider, okay? Now, there are determinants of economic development. It is now divided into two categories: the economic factors like your capital, the technology and market. Now, for the second one is the non-economic factors. We have your government, religion, education, social structure, values, and culture. Now, when you say economic factors, we cannot avoid, but money is said to be one of the most important things because you cannot you cannot come up with those infrastructures without revenues, without money, okay, by the government, without money coming from the people. Another one is the technology and also the market, okay? Now, we have also here the non-economic factors. When you say non-economic factors class, we have also the government. We need the support of the government. We need the support of the religious sector. We also need the support of the educational sector. So we will always try this time to uh, look at the implications. So, what is the need of the industry and who can now respond to that? It is now the educational sector for that. Okay, so that is what we mean when we now talk about your non-economic factors, even the social structure, the people, the community, even our values. So I hope that once you will now be working, you will not be doing what you have stated in your learning contract, because I have heard a lot of people, a lot of students telling that they try to procrastinate, which should not be done in once they're now contributing in the economy and also our culture. Okay, so well, we have that values in the Philippines wherein we are very hospitable, that Filipinos are very diligent, that Filipinos this time are hardworking people. So that is already innate in us. It is already, we can already see that in us. Okay? So here, class, we have the distinction or the difference between economic development from economic growth. We have the first implications. Economic development implies an upward movement of the entire social system in terms of income, savings, and investment, along with progressive changes in socio-economic structure of a country. So this is institutional and technological changes. We do have our economic growth. What does it mean? It refers to an increase over time in a country's real output of goods and services. So that we call your gross national product or real output per capita income. We also have the factors. So to differentiate economic development, in economic development, it relates to growth of human capital indexes, a decrease in inequality figures, and structural changes that improve the population's quality of life. Okay, while economic growth, it is now a gradual increase in one of the components of gross domestic product. So what we have there is the consumption, government spending, investment, net exports. Now, as to measurement, when you talk about economic development, it is more qualitative as compared to economic growth, which is quantitative. Qualitative because the measurement of ED or economic development is human development and index. We also have the gender related index. We also have your HPI or human poverty index. We have the infant mortality literacy rate. Now, as to your economic growth, this is now the increases in your gross domestic product. As to effect, it brings qualitative and quantitative changes in the economy. Whereas in economic growth, it brings quantitative changes in the economy. Okay? Now, as to relevance, economic development is more relevant to measure progress. And you will see now the quality of life in different nations, particularly in developing, intermediate, highly developed, and highly industrialized countries. Comparing now to economic growth, it is more relevant metric, so measurement for progress in developed countries. But it's widely used in all countries because growth is a necessary condition for development. Now, as to scope, this is concerned with structural changes in the economy, whereas in economic growth, it is concerned with increase in the economy's output. Okay, so another also, when we now talk about this, we are now moving on to national income accounting. What is national income accounting class? It is a system of statistics and accounts that keeps tracks of production. So what is production again? The creation of goods and services. Consumption, this is now the final utilization of goods and services. Savings, this is now the money not spent. And investment, this is now the money that is now intended this time to at least come up with production. Not only that, also to increase employment and also to increase productivity. So this investment is for us now to track overall our economic performance. Okay, let's now see this illustration. Now, when you talk about national income accounting, first and foremost, okay, we need to have what we call here your production. So this one usually is being, it is owned by the business firms. It is owned by industries, okay? So they will now be producing these goods and services. Now, people will spend, or they will now spend their money. They will now buy goods and services to these firms. So that is now for them to have expenditures, okay? So they're going now to dole out money for this. So the producers here will now be receiving an income, okay? Now, so with your people, the households, these are the households. So they are the consuming entity. Now, since they need to consume, they need also to seek employment. So who will now employ them? This business firms. So this people in the households now will be employed by this one. And from this, they will also be receiving an income. Okay? So if the households will be consuming these goods and services produced by the firms, then the firms will be receiving an income. If the firms will also employ these people now will also be receiving an income. So it is actually a vicious cycle. So it keeps track of production, consumption, and with that, you will now see here, there is now what we call a relationship between expenditures and income. So if these people are not being employed, then they cannot spend. They don't have the capacity this time to purchase these goods and services. Good that they are being employed, so they have money to purchase these goods and services produced by these firms. So with the firms, if the household will not spend for their for their own food, so if they will just be keeping this money and they will not spend, okay, they will not purchase, then what will happen now? There will now be a zero production. So there will be no income for the firms. So again, when you talk about national income accounting, it is a system of statistics and accounts that keeps track of production, consumption, savings, and investment, and that includes your expenditures and income to track overall economic performance. Okay, so with that, we still have here what we call a more profound illustration. The first one, you only have the two. We only have your firms and the household. This is the producing entity. This is now the consuming entity. Now, let's see now a wider and more profound explanation of the first illustration. This particular firms, these are now the firms, okay? Of course, they cannot just produce these goods and services without the resource market. Now, it is now the household, so this is now the household sector who will now be selling these resources. So who will now be giving land for this? Them. Labor, these people. Capital or money, these people. Entrepreneurial ability, these people. Okay? So in return, the businesses will now be paying them for the cost of rent, wages, interest, and profit, okay, for this. Now, so that we call it your resource market. It is now the household who will now be selling it to the firms. On the other hand, okay, the household sector will also be buying these goods and services. So this is now your market, okay, the product market. So if this is the resource market, we do have the product market. It is now the household who will now purchase these goods and services produced by the firm. It is now the reason because they need to spend money, they need to purchase. Therefore, with their purchases, the firm and industries will now be receiving an income, or we call it revenue. Okay? So, as you can see, it's just a vicious cycle. Okay? And so that is now the explanation in detail of the first illustration. Okay, let's continue. We now have this time a more general circular flow of income. Again, this is our firms, business firms. This is our household. Now, we have now other sectors here. We have the banks. We have your government sector, so banking sector, government sector, and this is now the foreign sector or abroad, okay? Now, the households here will now be saving their money, especially after spending it. There are still some that are now being left, so that will be their net savings. And this will now be given to the different banking institutions. And what reflects here from the banking institutions, it will now go this time to the different investors. So it will redound back to the benefit. So this banking institutions will allow now the different owners of these firms, industries who are producing these goods and services to borrow money. Okay? Sorry for that. Now from there, it will redound back to the benefit of these two, the firms and the household. I hope you're still with me. Now, the household also, or the people, will now be paying their taxes. And of course, the money that is now being paid will now go to the government. And for what purpose? The government will be spending the money for government expenditures or infrastructure projects. And who will again benefit from that? It will redound back to the benefit of both firms and households. Okay? This is true likewise, particularly to this household again. They will not only be buying their goods and services in the country, like for example, they purchase an imported jacket, they purchase an imported shoes, they purchase an imported appliances, technology, or any other things that are coming from abroad or from other countries. So the Philippine peso will go now to the rest of the world, okay? How can we cope up this money? Then we are supposed to be exporting also our products to other countries. So once we receive dollars from other countries, it will redound back again to the benefit of both the household and the firms. Now, the first one, your savings and investment, what policy now that can now affect this one, it is what we call your monetary policy. What policy will affect both taxes and government expenditures? It will now be fiscal policy. What policy that will now affect your import and export? It will now be trade policy. So again, that will be discussed in a separate lecture. Now, how can we measure total output? We have your gross domestic product, and we also have your gross national product. When you say gross domestic product class, this is what we call the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's jurisdiction. So in other words, when you say gross national product, it refers to the aggregate final output of citizens and businesses of an economy. Now, to compute now for this, so we will be having a computation on this once we reach now the three approaches of your GNP. So we have your GDP, we will subtract your gross national product minus your net factor income from abroad. Now, so with this one, we will also be having this time, okay, your GNP will be your gross domestic product plus net factor incomes from abroad. There are some goods and services that are not counted in our gross domestic product. Why? Number one, we have the non-market goods and services. These are goods and services not actually bought and sold for a price in a market setting. Example, a family hires a person through the classified section of the newspaper to clean and cook, then they need to pay for that. Therefore, that service is counted in the gross domestic product. However, if, let's say, the one who will be performing the task is a member of the family, alam nga namang babayaran mo pa siya. Of course not. So, that is not counted. Okay? Number two, we also have the underground activities that consist of unreported exchanges that will now take place outside the normal recorded market channel. So we have now here some example, the drug sales, gambling, prostitution, and the like. Okay? Those are underground activities. Number three will be the sale of used goods. Yun yung mga second hand. Okay? The GDP measures only the current production, yung occurring during the current year. Example, sale of a used car, sale of a used clothing is no longer counted because the car or clothing were already counted when they were originally produced. Okay? Take note of that. And then we also have the financial transactions like the trading of stocks and bonds because it does not represent the production of new assets. And then we also have the fifth, and that is now the government transfer payments. These are payments to a person that is not made in return for goods and services currently supplied. What are some examples of this? We have your GSIS benefits, the veterans benefits, and the like. And then number 6, we also have your leisure. This is not included because it is hard to quantify. Okay. So we have the 3 approaches to measure total output. We have the expenditure approach. We will have our computation, separate computation on this. I'm just discussing it, the definitions, okay? Income approach or income factor approach, the value-added approach. Now let's start with the expenditure approach. This will account for the amount of money spent by buyers on final goods and services, okay? Then we also have your final good. It refers to a good in the hands of the final user, end user, ultimate consumer. Then we also have your intermediate good. It refers to a good that will be used in the production of a final good. Okay, next. We also have here what we call the second one, the income at factor cost approach. So it measures total national income price at the value of the earnings of the factors of production. So we have now your gross national income is equal to your national income plus indirect taxes plus depreciation. Okay, that's how. Anyway, I'll be giving you the formula once we reach the computations. We also have the value added. This refers to the value contributed to a final good at each stage of production. So this one, the difference between the market value of all the goods that it produced and the cost of all the goods and materials that it purchased from other producers. Okay, so there you are. So those are our discussion in line with what we have for today. Okay, class, do you have any question? Question so far from our discussion today? May mga tanong?